Welcome back to another episode of the Meat Mafia podcast. If this is your first time joining us, we have one goal and one goal only, and that is that you, yes you, listen to this podcast and get at least one valuable piece of information that inspires you to go radically change your health today. If this is your second, third, fourth, or 100th time listening to the Meat Mafia podcast, we are so grateful to have you, and we are so thankful for your continued support. Before we get going, if you would not mind going and following us on all of our platforms, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and of course, Twitter, we would greatly appreciate it. This just allows us to expand our reach, and your reviews, comments, and feedback give us more and more things to think about and improve the show with. Lastly, this is a user-supported podcast and newsletter, and we would not be able to do what we love doing without your generous support and the support from our sponsors. We take great pride in the relationships that we've built with our sponsors and truly believe that they are the best resources out there for better health. Your support and their support, and you supporting them, means the world to us. If you are enjoying the podcast and getting value out of it, please check us out on the Fountain app below, where you can support us by streaming us sats or sending us support via our Fountain Bitcoin wallet. Without further ado, here is a word from our sponsors. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by the Carnivore Bar. The Carnivore Bar is a veteran-owned, animal-based company focused on bringing you the highest quality pemmican product on the market. Pemmican is an ancient tradition practiced by American indigenous cultures, and it's focused on simple ingredients: beef, tallow, and salt. It's built for grab-and-go snacking, and it's a great sort of travel, hiking, or school lunch snack. And it's really built for those long-lasting days where you can just run on basically no fuel other than just simple fats. It's rich in saturated fats and provides everything you need to sustain long-lasting energy throughout the busy day. In my opinion, this is a product that is an absolute must, so go check it out in the link below. Also, check out our podcast with the founder, Philip Meese. He does an incredible job breaking down the mission and the passion behind the company. And I think if you're interested in animal-based nutrition, Philip will inspire you with his product. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by Holy Cow Beef. Holy Cow Beef is regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef raised right here in Lubbock, Texas. Regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef is the gold standard of beef, and Ann and Weldon Warren have made it their lives' mission to provide incredibly high-quality beef to their local community and beyond. They have been raising their animals this way for decades. In fact, they were some of the most influential voices for getting grass-fed and grass-finished beef in Whole Foods back when Whole Foods was a startup grocery store. They were influential in setting the AGA standards, which is the American Grass-Fed Association, so you know they are doing things the right way, and on top of all of that, their beef tastes like butter. Grass-fed, grass-finished beef provides a superior omega-3 to omega-6 ratio than your typical beef, or in other words, it causes less inflammation in your body. So you are promoting a high-protein, high-fat diet with this amazingly high-quality beef, and saturated fats are playing their critical role in benefiting your body through supporting hormonal functions and cellular functions. And if you're looking for the highest quality beef, look no further than Holy Cow Beef. Leave your butcher box, that Australian and New Zealand raised meat, in the cart and order from your friends Ann and Weldon Warren over at Holy Cow Beef. I almost forgot the most important part there. Ann and Weldon Warren also accept Bitcoin as payment, so go check them out at their website in the link below, and you can pay in Bitcoin or in cash if you're looking to save your Bitcoin. I don't know about you all, but I am all about rewriting the incentives when it comes to healthcare, and Crowd Health is doing just that. Crowd Health is essentially crowdfunding for healthcare with a small HSA component mixed in. Paying through the nose for health insurance you may never use, only to be turned away when you actually need it, is incredibly frustrating. Also, the exorbitant costs of health insurance has so many baked in premiums that when you compare settling your doctor's bills by paying in cash versus using insurance, the cost is astronomical. So crowdfunding allows you to settle your medical bills in cash and then get the funding you need from your group through Crowd Health. This is a great alternative to health insurance for people who are low risk, healthy people who just want peace of mind knowing that if anything actually did happen, they do have a pool of funds to pull from to cover their medical costs. The best part, my group is saving a portion of the monthly opt-in in Bitcoin, and the rest is in cash. So those savings are going towards actually preserving long-term value for my group through a vehicle like Bitcoin. We are really excited about this concept, and since the business model is predicated on an incentive-based healthcare, it is a great concept. For people with low risk, minimal healthcare costs, it is a no-brainer. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code MAFIA for a discount on your first 6 months with Crowd Health. Dr. J, what's going on? Welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. Pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, as we were just saying before the show, I saw you on Mike Munsel's podcast talking about hormones and did a little bit more research on you. And I'm very excited to have this conversation to do a little bit of a deep dive on all the different estrogenics out there and talk about some of the hormone problems that seem to be prevailing the current people in the US and elsewhere. So excited to have you on and just let you share a little bit of your experience.
Yeah, man. Thanks. Yeah, it's a major problem. Like I talked to a functional doctor last week in Miami. I was down in Miami doing some educational videos with a hormone replacement doctor. And he said his practice used to have a rule that he didn't even allow, if you were lower than 40 years old, he wouldn't even allow you in his practice. And now I think he said it was 80% of his practice is people below 30 years old because so many young people are coming in with low hormones, and they kind of tricked everybody. They said that you have the hormones of an 80-year-old man, like if you have low testosterone or something.
Right.
But in reality, everybody's testosterone was declining around that time. So it looked like the 80-year-old, it looked like if you were 50, 60, 70, 80, around the 1980s, it looked like your testosterone was going down, which it was. But the same thing was happening with 20 and 30-year-olds, and nobody was paying attention to those people. So they blamed it on aging. Yeah, there's good research. There's a really interesting study with like tens of thousands of people, and they find that testosterone does not decline with age very much. It's very minor. It's like not even 100 points, So you don't even go from like 800 to 700. It's like 800 to 750 or something. It's like testosterone barely goes down. It's shocking.
And 100 points, maybe for some context, like 100 points in today's terms, like could be a lot, but is it like historically, wasn't like 1500 kind of like maybe ancestrally, like a normal score that you would have had for testosterone levels?
Our paleo ancestors, yeah. We have bone data and stuff from our paleo ancestors, and they were way up there. And then in the 80s, the most recent research in terms of general population was like average male 500.
Yeah,
so that's a huge problem just in itself. But now the average male's coming in at like 300, like a lot of people at 250, and the doctors have normalized it. They're telling everybody that's fine, that's normal. Everybody's at 250. So that's another problem, right? On top of the problem of just being low, the problem of normalizing it.
Yeah. The normalization of all these unhealthy trends is it's terrifying, honestly, from a societal perspective. But maybe before we dive into everything, I know you've written a book, Estrogeneration, phenomenal read for anyone who's listening. Definitely go check it out. We'll put it in the show notes. Your background is in biochemistry from BU, correct?
Yep.
Where did this interest in hormone health come from? I'm curious sort of how you got involved and what's driven you further into it.
Yeah, well, the very first interaction where I started thinking about this stuff was at college orientation, like the first week in college, because they had an orientation speaker come in from the city. It was in Florida. I went to college in Florida. And they said, don't drink the water out of the faucet unless you filter it, because it has so much birth control. And I was like, damn, like I didn't know there was birth control in drink water. And obviously I started filtering it like religiously after that. All of us did, and they were saying basically Florida's at sea level and women are pissing birth control down the toilets, and then it just goes right back into the water supply. So they're good at killing the viruses and they're good at killing the bacteria, but they weren't filtering out the hormones that were getting put into the water. And the plastic chemicals too, and some of the other chemicals that I didn't even know were a problem at that time, are an additive problem. Now I know this. And it's not just Florida. Unfortunately, if you look at the research, which I did in my book, and I go through this, a lot of big cities, basically if you're in a big city, you're going to find a lot more concentrated birth control in the drinking water as a general rule. And then people out in the rural areas aren't exactly exempt either, because there's a lot of chemicals that they spray on your foods that act like estrogen. So we're getting hit with basically birth control at a low dose over really long periods of time. So that shouldn't surprise anybody that testosterone is declining. But then the plastics are a problem, and the personal care products, and there's just a bunch of different things. So that's what I wrote the book on, and that's why I got into it. Really, just birth control and drinking water.
And maybe you could help me understand just like the framing around hormones, because I feel like when we talk about them, like testosterone is like the male hormone and estrogen is the female hormone. But does that like surface level assumption? It seems like overly simplified if I had to guess.
Yeah, I mean, testosterone is super important for women too, even though they didn't really study it until, the 2000s. Basically, they were just totally ignoring it. And part of it was the technology, because it's in the nanogram levels. It was hard to accurately measure it until fairly recently. But I'm sure women have been declining also, just based on the data from the last 20 years. You see really, really low levels, especially post-menopause. But basically, like sex hormones are interesting. So the definition of a sex hormone is a hormone that's made from cholesterol. All right. So there's like 4 or 5 categories. There's different people that categorize hormones differently, but usually it's like 4 categories. There's hormones that are made from fats, like fatty acids, like eicosanoid hormones or something, anti-inflammatory hormones that your body can make. There's hormones like based on proteins, like insulin, right? Like a big long chains of amino acids. That's another category of hormones, protein hormones. And then there's amino acid hormones. They're just made from a single amino acid, not a big chain of them. And then, of course, like I said, there's the sex hormones, which are all made from cholesterol. Technically, vitamin D is a sex hormone, even though they call it a vitamin. If we were to discover vitamin D today, we would call it a hormone. And so vitamin D is one of them. Estrogen, progesterone, DHEA, pregnenolone, right? Testosterone. There's a whole bunch of them. And the interesting thing about testosterone is that and estrogen too, to be honest, like estrogen and testosterone are super interesting, because you have receptors in your body that pick these hormones up all over the body. Like with a lot of hormones like leptin or something, like you maybe have heard of leptin. It makes you feel full after you're done eating. It's a hormone that tells your brain like, hey, stop eating. You had enough food. Leptin is literally made by your fat cells and dumped into your bloodstream. And when it gets to your muscle cells, there's no receptors that grab it out. So it just kind of goes into the muscles and comes back out. It goes into your liver, comes back out. There's nothing that grabs it out. There's no receptors. When it gets to your brain, there's receptors for leptin, and they pick it up and they say, hey, stop eating, right? You're full. The thing about estrogen and testosterone that's different than leptin is you have receptors in your body in like all your cells for estrogen and testosterone. So it goes in your muscles, boom, it gets grabbed up by receptors, it stays in there and it causes muscle changes. It goes into your brain, got receptors in there, boom, they grab onto it, it changes your brain. You can see depression, for example, and when you screw up your estrogen or your testosterone levels. You see Alzheimer's increase when you screw up your hormones. Goes into your liver, it goes into your whatever, like you basically, like your fat cells, right? Like testosterone is involved in fat burning. You have receptors almost every cell in your body. So as you can imagine, if you screw up these hormones, now you've screwed up your whole body. Right? That's a different problem than like, oh, I just screwed up my kidneys or just screwed up my liver or whatever, which is bad enough. But now we're talking about like huge lists of side effects that are potentially problematic, and they happen really slowly over time if you're slowly disrupting your hormones.
And from a dietary standpoint, it's interesting you say like in 1980, this is where we started to see some of these trends start to happen, like in the testosterone levels, because that's also where you see our dietary guidelines were introduced in the 70s, and fat started to get demonized, which is to your point around cholesterol, like dietary cholesterol is actually an important part of the fundamental building blocks of these important sex hormones. Is that something that you hone in on when you're talking to people about, hey, you need to start eating some cholesterol here?
Yep, exactly. If you want your testosterone super, super low, go vegan, because that will lower your cholesterol down to the bottom of the bucket. And you're guaranteed to have lower testosterone than you should if your cholesterol is lower than it should be. I mean, that's a guarantee. So saturated fat is an awesome building block for cholesterol, and cholesterol is an awesome building block for testosterone. So start with saturated fat. Remember, we're animals. We are animals. Your body has lots of saturated fat. When you eat animals, there's lots of saturated fat. That's totally natural. The transition is easy and smooth into your system. Your body's allowed to make good levels of cholesterol when you have plenty of saturated fat. This idea like we need all these plant fats and all these weird polyunsaturated fats, like there's some kind of necessary missing link to our nutrition, is all marketing. Yeah. And that's true of all the dietary stuff. This whole like we need all these grains and the food pyramid is based on the grains in the 1980s, like you're saying. Complete nonsense. The idea of breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Complete nonsense. I mean, that's all marketing. This is all marketing, right? And the New England Journal of Medicine, right? They've done studies on autophagy and intermittent fasting. They basically, the data shows that breakfast is the most important meal of the day to skip.
Right.
I mean, you could skip dinner too if you want to skip a meal, but like the point is intermittent fasting is way better than this idea like, oh, eat every 3 hours or whatever, that nonsense that some doctors and dietitians are promoting. And the drug companies love it, right? They're not actively trying to convince people that that's wrong, even though the research is really obvious, because it's making people sicker. So then they end up on more prescription drugs. And same with the lower hormone levels. It's making people sicker. They end up on more prescription drugs. So nobody's saying anything because there's a lot of money being made on that end of the thing.
Yeah.
So it's the system is kind of set up to work against your health. And you have to basically take your own initiative on this stuff and fend for yourself. It's just like the cholesterol lab test, right? Like you go to these doctors and they all tell you you're high all the time. And you have to understand the research for yourself and take your own health into your hands, because like these obese doctors that can like hobble in there with a cane at like 50 years old, and I've got like 70-year-old friends that are out surfing, like Mark Sisson.
Yeah.
Who do you believe? Who do you want to trust? You know what I mean? It's pretty obvious.
Equip's unflavored prime has one single ingredient derived directly from grass-fed beef protein. All the boxes. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code in the description to get a discount. That's like my model for framing my thinking around health. It's like take someone like Mark Sisson, who's 70 years old, and whatever the hell he's doing, just do it.
Exactly.
You don't need to overcomplicate it. Like you can, but you don't need to. And
age amplifies risk, right? So like as we age, we become more sensitive to health issues. So you can get away with, getting hangovers and stuff when you're 20 years old. You can kind of get away with it because your body bounces back quick enough. You can't get away with that when you're 70 years old. Right. And so that's an indicator, even at age 20, it's not good for you. You're just getting away with it. And the same thing is true of a lot of stuff in the health space. It's like, if you've got somebody who's 70 years old and they're dialed in like that, that's pretty impressive, because that tells you the reality of the situation. It's not just, we're just aging, so therefore we're screwed and we have to be hobbling around with a cane. You can do it. People can do it. But part of it too is customized. You have to look at genetics and you have to think individually on this stuff instead of just trying to imagine that everybody's exactly the same too. So there's that.
Yes. I was going to ask you, I had this down as a question because I saw a video of you talking about kind of this like one size fits all model for health, and it doesn't really work that way. And it seems like that's kind of how we lose some of these nuanced details around individual health. It's like, hey, we all come from different parts of the world, and our bodies, we're different blood types, tons of different environmental factors that play into how our body responds to the food that we take in. So I'm curious, like, do you think that's just a big oversight that we should try to fix in as the food system and as the medical system try to right size some of these problems that have manifested themselves?
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you specifically mentioned blood type too, because it reminds me of that book, the Eat Right for Your Blood Type book.
Yeah,
I was literally so mad as I was reading that book, I couldn't even finish it. And I never do that. I think that's the only book I've ever started and couldn't finish it because the science was so outrageous and ridiculous. I like outrageous books. I read some interesting books that are kind of off the wall and they're pushing the limits and boundaries pretty far. And I like that. Like, I'm interested in that as long as it fits with the science.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot of bias within the science, right? Like soy is a good example and things. You have these big companies pushing a lot of science. So you have to be super skeptical of that stuff. But the problem with this Eat Right for Your Blood Type thing is it's almost true. It's like we come from all these tribes around the world, right? And before we had airplanes and cars and all this stuff, we were pretty much in these little regional areas, in our little tribes as humans. And, the genetics were pretty similar, right? Like, between all these different tribes, we all had pretty similar genetics. But this idea, like that's reflected in the blood type. So like, let's say you have a tribe over here in Germany and they've got blood type A or whatever. And let's say you got a tribe over here in North America and they got blood type B. Again, whatever blood type, it doesn't matter. And then, obviously now we've got this melting pot where people are all kinds of different backgrounds. It's merged all kinds of different ways. And then you take just the blood type and you say, well, let's assume that they can eat grains and now they can't eat meat and they need to eat lots of pecans or whatever. You just make up like a list of random stuff. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense because if their blood type indicated they have 1,000 genes that were, in this certain way, and then this blood type over here indicated they had 1,000 genes that were different in this way. And then they merge together and like it's such a mix and mash and it's just all kinds of ridiculousness to just basically generalize and say, you've got this blood type, you need to eat this food or that food or whatever. It's so frustrating because some of it's right. Like there is differences in people with certain blood types,
right?
Just specific to like how your body clots and some other stuff, but those are minor. The way the book was written was like extrapolating and saying like, this is the way that you determine your entire diet structure. It's like, oh my gosh,
I haven't read it yet, but I might have to read it just for entertainment value after hearing you talk about it.
It's frustrating.
I really want to dive into some of the estrogenic topics. And in your book, you have the male reproductive system list, I think, that you kind of lay out of like 7 estrogenic ways that we come into contact with these estrogenic compounds. One is like plants, fungi, some sunscreens, your BPAs. I'm curious, could you unpack that list and just explain sort of what these estrogenic chemicals, compounds do to us, and then how they're actually coming into play? Like in what mode are they interacting with our body?
Yeah. So oftentimes when I give talks, the book, obviously I have a different, like the list is more expansive and it's a whole book so people can really get into it. Usually when I do talks and things, I just break it down into maybe 4 categories and say like there's personal care products, there's plastics, there's food stuff, right? Like soy and stuff like that. And then there's what's another one? I break it down. I do this in so many different subcategories. Sometimes I can't really remember, but yeah, I mean, you mentioned a bunch of them specifically, which is helpful. But in the fungus too, right? Like I kind of put that in the food category because a lot of these grains and things, they have a lot of mold. And again, I go through the details in my book because it's really striking. If you compare Europe and America, just the illegal allowable limits of mold in our grains is ridiculous. The difference, like we don't even regulate mycoestrogen, mold estrogen. There's like mold, one of the mold toxins is estrogen. Molds secrete a form of estrogen. It's called zearalenone. So it's got this weird name, so people don't like to talk about it, but zearalenone is estrogen. It basically screws up your hormones. It's not natural estrogen. It's a fake version of estrogen that mold secretes to kill people and stuff. And, it's like basically one of the defense mechanisms of mold. And in America, we literally have there's no legal safety limit. It's just like as much as you want in your food, it doesn't really matter. Whereas in Europe, they have, not only do they have a legal safety limit for mold estrogen in grains and food, they have it in the animal feed. Even in your horse food, you can't have too much mold estrogen. Wow. So they're even stricter in Europe on what they're feeding their animals than we are in America for what we're giving humans. That alone is enough reason for me to say, look, let's not eat grains, right? At least if they're not organic. The inorganic grains, they have so many problems with the facilities they store them in and the amount of fungus that kind of grows in that stuff. And again, it's just not worth it. I don't care what your genetics are. You don't want to be ingesting mold estrogen, zearalenone. So that goes into the food category. Atrazine goes into the food category because that's another herbicide. That's something we're ingesting in our food. Atrazine is sprayed on grains. So this is the second strike against grains. And so is glyphosate, of course, right? Glyphosate is the number one used herbicide and atrazine is the number two. And by the way, when I wrote my book, I didn't write much about glyphosate because there wasn't a lot of convincing evidence that it was acting like estrogen. But ironically, after I published my book, there's more studies coming out now that it's actually acting like estrogen. And I had a hard time wrapping my head around that because it doesn't look anything like estrogen. Like atrazine, if you look at the molecule, like remember, I'm a biochemist, right? And if you look at the molecule of atrazine, it's like, yeah, that looks like estrogen. I can see how that could dock on the estrogen receptor. Like it can fit into that key. It's like a key that fits into a lock. I can see it. But glyphosate, I could not see it at all, right? It looks like a glycine molecule. It looks like an amino acid. That's where it's derived from. Glyphosate comes from the word glycine, and it's got a phosphate group, so it's glyphosate. But it looks nothing like estrogen. But what's interesting about glyphosate, and you probably know this, it actually is a chelator, right? It can bind metals. And that's one of the problems with it is it can like reabsorb your minerals. Like you can get magnesium deficiencies and things because it can be grabbing out your magnesium and basically you poop it out, right? Because it's chelating your metals that you need, these minerals that your body needs, these necessary nutrients. So one of the things I think that's becoming more clear now in the research is that glyphosate, say you've got one molecule of glyphosate, just imagine like a rectangle shape, right?
Yeah.
And then it grabs onto a metal. So there's a little ball on top of the rectangle, and then another glyphosate can come and stick on top of the metal as well on the other side. So now you've got this giant rectangle or this big square shape. Now it's looking like estrogen, right? Like I think that combination of those molecules sticking together is suddenly triggering your hormones. And so I think that's what's happening with glyphosate because there's a lot of good data showing like it's literally additive to soy. So in other words, if you have soy, it's acting like estrogen. And you can make arbitrary units and say like it's acting like on a scale from 0 to 100, it's acting like 10. And then you add glyphosate, and now it's acting like 20.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's definitely acting like estrogen. And then you throw in plastics and you store this stuff in plastic, like baby food. They did a study with infant formula. And then it's like you add another 10 units, so you got like 10 from the soy and 10 from the plastic and 10 from the glyphosate, right? And so it's all causing additive problems. And soy, by the way, is obviously a food item that's super pervasive in our country, right?
Yeah.
And everybody agrees soy acts like estrogen. Like there's no scientists that say, well, I don't think it acts like estrogen. Everybody agrees that one acts like estrogen. The debate sometimes with soy is whether it's good estrogen or bad estrogen. And I can go into the details if you want. I know we've got time, but it's like, do you want to go into the weeds or not?
Well, my question would be, does it matter if it's like fermented or like the form in which it comes? Okay,
yeah,
gotcha.
Definitely matters, yeah. Like soy sauce, basically no estrogen in there.
Okay.
Regular soy products, like even soy protein powders and stuff are full of estrogen. It's surprising when you see the data. Like the actual numbers, and again, I'll just use arbitrary units instead of getting into nanograms per deciliter and milligrams per kilogram and all this kind of stuff. But in Canada, they tested over 100 plants for phytoestrogen, just looking and saying how much plant estrogen is in these plants: kale, cabbage, broccoli, carrots, whatever, it didn't matter. Over 100 plants, and soy was over 100,000 units of estrogen, and all the other plants except for flax were under 1,000. So it's like 1,000 and then 100,000. It's like soy and flax were like way the heck up here, and all the other ones were just like so minor. And soy sauce was like 100.
Wow.
It's like nothing basically. But soy protein was over 1,000. Like anything soy, like if it's not fermented, it was way the heck up there on that spectrum.
And why is it so? Are there any other foods that you would look out for in terms of an estrogenic effect?
Let me think about that. So anything that's moldy, peanuts are a little bit notorious for mold. Coffee, sometimes if you get really crappy quality coffee.
It sounds like
red 40 too. I should add red 40. That is in foods. That artificial red food coloring. Again, totally illegal in a lot of countries, and in Europe it's actually legal, but they have to put a safety warning on foods if they have red 40, so they don't use it. They use beet juice over there.
Gotcha.
Because who wants a big warning label on your food when you don't need one, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's another one people should avoid.
I was pretty stunned by that atrazine. That's what it's called?
Yeah.
I was stunned by the regulatory acceptance of that and the pervasiveness of what these chemicals end up in our drinking water if you're spraying them at the volume that we're spraying them at. And particularly where we're spraying them, it's like we're spraying them in the Midwest, which is right on top of some of the biggest aquifers in the US, or what used to be the biggest aquifers. And, I imagine all that runoff ends up in the Mississippi and in drinking water all across the country. So to have the effects of that be so bad and harmful for people is really astonishing.
Yeah. And the chemical is specifically designed to last a long time, right? It's designed to not break down. It's designed to have a super long shelf life. So it's not surprising when it leaks into the water supply, it stays there. It doesn't like magically degrade. The bacteria, there's bacteria underground. There's not tons of them. The water's pretty clear because it gets filtered through the sand and stuff, through all these layers of dirt and earth. But even if there is bacteria down in that aquifer, they don't know how to break this stuff down. These chemicals are man-made, artificial, never been found in nature. Same with your gut bacteria. Your gut bacteria, like, what in the hell is this stuff? Like if you eat soy, your gut bacteria has a pretty good chance of breaking down a lot of the estrogen. It might not, but at least you have a good shot at it. And some people have really crappy gut bacteria and they do a terrible job of breaking down. Other people have amazing gut bacteria and they break it all down. It's kind of a gamble, like especially for a man. It's like, do you want to be gambling your hormones with a bunch of soy products? I don't. But if people want to gamble that way, it's cool, but at least their body has kind of a shot at it, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And flax is the same thing. It's like, flax has side benefits because it has omega-3s and it's got CBD. It's literally got cannabinoids and stuff. But my thing is just get cannabinoids from hemp if you really want cannabinoids, and get omega-3s from fish if you really want omega-3s. You know what I mean? You don't have to go with flax.
Right. Yeah, that one always interests. That's an intriguing one to me. It's like there's other sources out there for healthy omega-3s. Why choose the one that is estrogenic? Could you maybe speak to the implications of what low testosterone actually is, like on an individual basis? Like, what would that person, you're looking at a person who's got like 200, whatever the units is.
Nanograms per deciliter.
Nanograms per deciliter for their testosterone score. Like, what is that person going to feel like? What sort of things are they going to be doing lifestyle wise that are promoting that level to be lower than usual?
Yeah, it's different for different people. Usually it's low energy, first of all. Like just across the board, you just don't feel as motivated and as energized, and you get tired easier because your body doesn't recover very well. One of the reasons a lot of athletes overdose testosterone is because you heal so much faster. It's not because you're getting giant muscles all the time. Sometimes you do if you push your muscles really hard, but you just heal faster. Even your joints, like the soft tissue in your joints heals faster. You know what I mean? So there's just a lot of healing properties. And obviously, if you're just broken down and you're not recovering, like imagine if you went to the gym twice a day, you'd be exhausted all the time, right? And your body you'd probably get weaker and weaker and weaker if you're actually lifting heavy weights in the gym twice a day. Like say you went and deadlifted twice a day for a month, you'd probably lose muscle mass. Because again, if your body can't recover, you're literally just going to be tired. And that's exactly what happens if you have low testosterone. Your body basically thinks that you're overtraining all the time and you can't recover from just normal stuff that you're doing. So then your body's tired. So that's the first thing. You have a higher risk of atherosclerosis and Alzheimer's and these diseases that are related to plumbing in your body too, because if your plumbing is all screwed up, like you have plaque, you're not transporting blood and you're getting, clogged arteries and all kinds of different issues there. And all of that stuff originates from inflammation. Like plaque in the arteries, inflammation is the root cause, right? A lot of mental disorders, inflammation is the root cause. A lot of almost everything, right? Like a lot of joint issues, inflammation is the root cause. Autoimmune issues, inflammation is the root cause. You can just go on and on. And why do I bring that up? Because testosterone protects against inflammation. It's very anti-inflammatory. It specifically is through something called interleukins. It inhibits interleukins. So if you have a lot of these inflammatory chemicals, they're triggering your immune system, right? They're communicating to your immune system that you have an infection, even if you don't. And those immune cells get all hyper aggressive and start chewing stuff up. They think there's a bacteria in your bloodstream or viruses or whatever, and they start chewing stuff up. Testosterone helps to calm them down. Like it basically keeps them in check. So if your testosterone is super low, they tend to be more aggressive. You tend to see more inflammation. You tend to see more autoimmune issues. And that's, again, very pervasive. There's a lot of conditions. So it could be anything, right? You can see a ton of different things. And like I mentioned, like just mental health, and sex drive obviously is the big one. Everybody's talking about sex drive. But before I talk about sex drive, bone density is huge too. And it gets super overlooked. That's the most frustrating one for me for women, because that's a huge overlooked issue too, is this idea that that's one of the biggest problems postmenopausal is low testosterone. A lot of people are focused on estrogen, progesterone, but when women have low testosterone, their bone density gets super brittle and super weak. And the doctors want to put them on prescription drugs that barely do anything, right? They have like a 1% increased bone density over 20 years or something. It's almost laughable.
Wow.
And it's just sex hormones. Like they just need sex hormones and some weightlifting so their body can recover and build bone density. And again, the pharma companies are making a killing on this nonsense, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of important things. And again, I should circle back to sex drive because that's a pretty obvious problem, right? Like if men don't have sex drive the way they're supposed to, right, compared to our ancestors, well then, that just demotivates men. Like in animal studies, it literally demotivates them to do anything. Like not just chasing females around, but it literally just demotivates them from working out and from whatever, even for mice and rats, which is hilarious, but especially for humans, which obviously we do a lot more diverse things than mice and rats.
Right. Yeah. I mean, messing with those biological incentives seems like a dangerous game to play. And I've heard you talk about the concept of male feminization, which I hadn't come across that phrase, that expression until I came across your work, but it's one that it's powerful. I mean, that idea that guys are just becoming a little bit weaker because of this problem, it's hugely impactful, not just on an individual basis, but what you're talking about is it's much more societal too.
Exactly. I mean, you have less muscle, you have less bone density, right? Like, you're less driven, you're less sexually motivated, you're less, like a lot of things. Just less masculine. And it's, a lot of it's measurable. You can measure it with the testosterone. Like lower testosterone is male feminization by definition. You can measure it other ways too, by like looking at testes size and all these like gonads and reproductive organs and things like that. And you can see it in women too, because there's a little bit of a paradox with a lot of these estrogen chemicals. A lot of the paradox is men are becoming feminized and women are more androgenized. They're more masculinized with these chemicals. You see it in animal studies, literally, and you can look at the data. It's pretty shocking. And usually you can just look at it with the testosterone. So you add testosterone to mice, and if you're doing it for the females, they lean more androgen. And if you add it to the males, they lean more feminine. So in other words, it's neutralizing. It's causing general neutralization a little bit in that direction. It's not completely causing it, but it's pushing it in that direction.
Right.
And this is because, women obviously don't have very much testosterone naturally. They have a lot of estrogen. And so when you start messing with that estrogen at the hormone level, you start basically pushing it in the direction of masculine phenotype, right? Mm-hmm. Masculinization. And it's more pronounced in men than women. So like when you give men, or animals, at least male animals, these chemicals, they get more feminized because it just lowers the testosterone. It basically tells your body that you've got a lot of estrogen. Even if you don't, it tells your body like, hey, we've got tons of estrogen. Why are we making more testosterone? Because a lot of male testosterone comes from estrogen, basically all your male estrogen comes from testosterone. It's aromatized from testosterone.
Interesting.
I said it wrong just to like totally confuse you, but if you have really high testosterone as a male, usually you also have really high estrogen as a male because your body converts some of that testosterone to estrogen. That's a normal thing. That's a healthy thing. There's a balance there. There's like a ratio you're supposed to have. In other words, if your testosterone is super high and your estrogen is super, super low, that's actually bad for you.
Okay. That was going to be my next question is it a zero-sum game where like you're shooting for like, if we're saying testosterone and estrogen work in unison here, 60 units of testosterone, like, does that mean like you automatically have lower estrogen, or does it, how does that interplay work?
Usually, yeah. Like usually if your testosterone is 250, your estrogen is like 20 or whatever, or 2, like it's probably 2. And if your testosterone is 2000, your estrogen will be like 200. You know what I mean? Like it'll reflect the numbers if you're healthy and you're doing things naturally. Now, obviously, if you're injecting stuff, sometimes those balances get totally screwed up. And I'm talking about doping and all that, but that's different. That's, that's complicated and messy.
So in that example where like you're basically saying that there's like a healthy ratio between the two.
Correct.
How is that excess estrogen when you have high testosterone being used in the body so that it's not like, because when I hear like this estrogenic line of conversation, it's like, oh, estrogen's bad, but I don't want to like oversimplify it to the point where it's like, people don't understand, hey, you're going to have higher estrogen levels if you have higher testosterone.
Yeah. Well, first of all, artificial estrogen, like we talked about, like the mold estrogen, soy estrogens, plastic chemicals that are acting like estrogen, red 4-D, like those are bad. You can just basically blanket statement those and just say they're bad. Your body doesn't know how to deal with that stuff. The more of that stuff you're getting in your system, the worse it is. The more additive they are. So that stuff you can just throw a blanket on and say they're bad. Now, the natural estrogen, in general, your body does a good job regulating the natural levels as long as it's not perverted with artificial estrogens. And in general, those are actually really good. They have protective benefits across the board. They're protective for your mental health and protective for arteries and all kinds of things. Estrogen, even in men. So in general, it's only, like I say, it's only if it gets way too high, and that's very rare and unusual, and it's usually genetic, but it's almost always because of the artificial estrogen. When men have man boobs and gyno and all this other stuff, like symptoms of really high estrogen, usually you check their blood tests and it's pretty normal. And the doctors are always like, oh, this is so strange, but I'm going to put you on aromatase inhibitors anyways, and they basically lower their estrogen anyway. And sometimes that helps a little bit, but it doesn't really address the root cause, because the root cause is generally, number one, low testosterone, because the ratio is off, right? If your testosterone is low and your estrogen is high, that's a major problem, right? If your estrogen is high and your testosterone is also high, that's awesome. Like that's a 2 thumbs up. You feel amazing. You look amazing. But if your estrogen is kind of low and your testosterone is kind of low and you got all these crazy estrogen symptoms, that's artificial estrogen. And clinics don't have the capacity to check that stuff. it's super difficult to check. It's back to the nanograms, and it's just the fact that nobody's motivated to check it. Because what are they going to do? Tell you to stop eating grains? Of course not, right? Grains lower your cholesterol.
Yeah.
So they can't tell you that. But so they're not going to check it. But in research studies, we check it, and it's outrageous how high our levels are. You know, like when we're doing studies and you start looking at these plastic chemicals and things in people's blood, and these mold toxins in Americans, and these red 40s and sunscreen chemicals, like oxybenzone, right? Like, you know, oxybenzone is one of the common ingredients in cheap sunscreen in America.
Yeah.
Yeah. One application of sunscreen, 7 days later, it's still in your blood above the government safety limits.
Wow.
Even the government safety limits, which suck. You know, the government safety limits are ridiculously relaxed, and they're not very good. But, and again, like in Europe, for example, a lot of these sunscreen, like oxybenzone is illegal in a lot of countries. Illegal. Like 0 is the safety limit. You know what I mean? And in America, they have like this high safety limit, and you exceed that with one application. So, you know, it's a major problem if you're not measuring those chemicals and you're assuming that like, oh, let's take an aromatase inhibitor to solve all these estrogen problems.
Where can you make the most progress in turning these problems around on an individual basis? Like if I'm sitting here going, oh my God, this is scaring the shit out of me.
Yeah.
What do I need to change first?
Yeah. Well, the mindset is the first thing, right? Because just recognizing the problems, it opens up your world, because people are living life just surrounded by plastics, and they don't think there's any problem with that most of the time. And as soon as you recognize that is a problem, especially with children, right? Like think about all those children toys that the kids are chewing on all day long. That's all plastic. You're screwing up their gender. You're screwing up their health. And so start with just thinking about it. And then the other thing is I generally say fragrances, like the personal care products, overhaul that crap and overhaul your drinking water. If you're filtering your drinking water and you're not storing it in plastic, you're doing an awesome job. And if you're getting rid of these cheap personal care products that are filled with weird fragrances and stuff that are made from petroleum, they're not found in nature. These are chemicals that are acting like estrogen. Get rid of that crap and get fragrance free if you don't know what else to do. And I have a website where I kind of list some examples and some of the stuff that I personally use, and it's free to look at. And it's pretty inexpensive. This idea like, oh, you got to buy these super high priced, whatever, the Whole Foods soaps and stuff. I mean, you can, a lot of them are awesome, but they're pretty high priced. Yeah. And if you can't afford that, there's no reason to worry. You can still find a lot of good stuff out there. That just go fragrance free if you're in doubt.
Do you think a shower filter is necessary as well with some of the chemicals that, you know, your skin is absorbent as well?
Oh, yeah.
So I imagine some of that gets absorbed through your skin.
Yeah, it's funny. Dr. Michael Skinner, Skinner, he did a TED talk on epigenetics and inheritance of some of these health problems from estrogen chemicals. And he raises like 5,000 mice at any given time. Like if you go to his lab right now, he's probably got like 5,000 mice going, and he tests multi-generational impact. So he exposes like one generation of mouse to these chemicals, to atrazine, to birth control, to phthalates from plastics, to parabens. He literally uses these chemicals. And then he looks to see what happens to the next generations. He doesn't continue to expose the next generations. He just exposes the mother. And then he looks at like 4 generations out, and he sees health impacts 4 generations out, like from these estrogens. And he is super pessimistic. He thinks we're like going to go extinct. He literally thinks we're screwed. But what's funny about it is his daughter's pregnant, or she was when I had lunch with him recently. I think this was like a year ago. So she's probably not pregnant anymore, but he said, and this is a quote from him, and I purchased her a whole house water filter system. That's what he told me.
Wow.
And I was like, well, it's funny, you know, like you're worried we're going to go extinct, but here you are like doing something about it. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm not as pessimistic as him, and I don't study the animals quite as closely. So maybe I should be, but like I have a whole house filter on my house too. It's not super complicated. It's just a unit that I put in myself. I cut the copper pipes and I just plugged on this unit, and unfortunately, they don't make the one that I have anymore. I have this big stainless steel thing, and it's got like the activated charcoal. But, and again, I just installed it myself. It was pretty easy. I know how to solder and stuff, so it's not like some giant problem, but you know, it's kind of low on the priority list if you can't if you have a budget and you're in college and that kind of stuff.
Right.
Focus on it, but definitely filter the water that you're drinking directly into your system, because you absorb the chemicals out of that a lot more readily than the stuff coming on your skin. And definitely overhaul your personal care. It's on like I did it. Michael Skinner did it. We have whole house filters, and it's a good idea. Like I say, it's hard to say for sure how much of an impact that's going to make. And it depends on where you live. Like I live in Rochester, Minnesota.
Yeah.
The EPA's safety limits were exceeded for 7 different chemicals in my town.
Gosh.
So I have most cities, it's like 1 or 2, maybe 3 if you have a really bad issue.
Yeah.
Where I live, it's 7 chemicals. So sure as hell, I'm putting a water filter on the whole house. You know? I have a friend at Mayo Clinic. She came from Puerto Rico or something. I don't remember exactly. And she came up here to Mayo Clinic to do some kind of a research, just a research sabbatical or something. And her skin was breaking out like crazy. And I was like, and she's like, I tried all these lotions and now I'm on all these cortisol creams and all this stuff. And it wasn't really helping, obviously, right?
Yeah.
And I told her, like, you got to just get a shower filter, and that completely fixed it. Easy.
No way. Yeah.
Her body wasn't used to this stuff that as Americans, we're so used to it because our bodies are just like giving up. Our body's like, well, screw it. We're just going to have to deal with these chemicals. It's like gluten, right? Like if you eat gluten all the time, your body kind of puts these shields up permanently. Yeah. And it just makes the baseline shitty. Like your baseline is just low energy.
Yeah. It's interesting. I do feel like as I've gotten like what I think the normal person would call extreme with just like how focused I am on kind of navigating some of these different problems, whether it's nutrition stuff or environmental, like avoiding some of the environmental toxins. I do feel like my diet is so clean that like if I do run into contact with some things, like I will run into like the weird skin issue. Do you feel that way about like when you do remove all this stuff, specifically with diet? Like if you remove all the crap like grains and like some of the disruptive vegetables out there, and obviously like the biggest issue is the processed foods, then your body, like if they do come into contact with them again for some reason, like a grain, it does like personally it's messed my gut up.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, because your body, it lowers those shields, right? Like basically like once you get all that crap out of your system, your body's like, oh, this is awesome. Like now I can just relax a little bit and put those shields down, and you can function normally and sleep better and have more energy and all this kind of stuff. And then, you throw those things back in your system, and now the shields are down. So they hit you a lot harder and you're more sensitive to it. And because that inflammation, it goes 0 to 10 pretty quick instead of if it's going from 5 to 10.
Right.
Yeah, that's only a 5-point jump. But if you're going from 0 to 10, that's a 10-point jump now.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. What does your sort of ideal diet look like in terms of avoiding a lot of the inflammatory markers and a lot of the toxins out there?
Well, I start with blood sugar because I've looked at optimal levels of blood sugar, not just normal, not just average. Average Americans are like 100 on their blood sugar, and that's outrageous. And the doctors will tell them it's fine, right?
Yeah.
And so
fasting blood sugar, you're saying?
Fasted blood glucose, yeah. And prick your finger, get a $20 finger pricking tool. I recommend that to people basically all the time. And if you're below 85, that's the optimal number. Fasted in the morning, you got to be below 85. If you're not, cut carbs. I don't care how extreme you have to get. Even cut protein if you have to. You got to get below 85. Some people have had so many decades of high carb, their body just like struggles to get down below 85 initially. But once you get it down there, you can bring all that protein back and just kick ass. But initially, sometimes you have to be pretty extreme. But most of the time, just cut carbs, or start skipping a few meals, that kind of stuff, and you get your blood sugar down. But that's the foundation. You have to get below 85. And then after that, to be honest, I look at people's genetics. So I do DNA consulting, and I get really nuanced with that individually, and it's very custom to different people. So that's super diverse.
What sort of surprising things have you come across with the DNA dietary recommendations? I'm sure there's a few that stand out.
Yeah, so I had somebody, man, I get people every day with interesting genes. Today I had a guy, he's only 50 years old. Crazy problems with his joints. I mean, just outrageous how many joint issues he has and back issues and stuff. And sure enough, he had like a whole list of genes in the joint section of my DNA report, and they were all triggered by inflammation. It wasn't like heavy metal risk. It wasn't dairy sensitivity. It wasn't whatever. It's just inflammation. And then you go to his diet section, and he was super sensitive to gluten, and he was freaking eating gluten all the time, like he was literally brewing his own beer, and he was thinking about starting a company, like a craft brewing company. And so he's not only inflamed from the gluten, but now he's got like the extra sugar and stuff that's probably in all that stuff. And he's got the alcohol, which is inflammatory, and he's hitting his body with that stuff every day. So that's pretty specific to him, but some people, they don't have any of those gluten sensitivity genes. And, I just kind of don't worry. I had somebody last week with a nightshade sensitivity gene, a couple of them, and those are super rare. I know there's a couple books written on nightshade sensitivities, but it's not that common. So it's not something I generally just tell everybody to avoid nightshades. But man, when you find those genes, it's like a lifesaver to get those out of your system.
Yeah. We had a really great conversation with Dr. Bill Schindler. I'm not sure if you have met him. He wrote the book, Eat Like a Human. And he was talking about nightshades being eliminated from his diet and having a huge impact in a positive way. But he's also talking about just like the way in which you can prepare some of these foods can eliminate a lot of the, I guess, like the way your body actually is able to handle them. So when he does eat nightshades, he like makes sure to never have like the peel on it, and he usually steams it or does the proper cooking technique. But
it sounds like lectins or something. Some people have lectin gene issues. There's so much diversity, and it's not always about the diet too. Sometimes, like I said before, it's heavy metals or something, and your body just doesn't clear heavy metals. And it's because, like, think about your ancestors. For thousands of years, a lot of our ancestors didn't have grains, or they didn't have nightshades all the time, or they didn't have dairy, or they didn't have water that had heavy metals. So why would their body have like a really robust system for clearing heavy metals, right?
Right.
And now all of a sudden they're eating tuna a couple times a week, and they got all this mercury or whatever. Maybe they grew up with lead paint and lead in the gasoline. So there's a lot of diversity, but a lot of people clear heavy metals amazing, and so it's pretty hard to generalize this stuff. You can, to an extent. Like I said, that blood sugar, it doesn't matter if you're 5 years old, 50 years old, 100 years old, 85 is optimal. It doesn't even matter if you're a little kid.
Right.
That's what the research shows. So again, that's a good place to start, because as we age, we become more sensitive to carbs. So our ability to eat, because people are always asking me, how much grams of carbs can I eat per day? And it's like, well, totally depends on your age, your activity levels, your hormones. Hormones are huge. Your sunshine exposure,
I was just going to say.
Yeah, like there's so many variables. It's like you prick your freaking finger and find out. Like that's the only way to do it. You have to.
Yeah, I think there's a study out there that talks about vitamin D and its important role in our ability to handle glucose. It's like,
it's a sex hormone.
Makes total sense. Like, that's near the equator is where most of the high carb fruits are being grown anyway. So it's like you're in a less seasonal manner. So, you're going to have more sunshine. And I think that like that totally kind of checks out from like a ancestral perspective.
That's a good point. Yeah. Well, and some people have flavonoid genes. Like, a lot of people have genes that are dependent on flavonoids to suppress inflammation. Flavonoids being color compounds in plants, right? Like blueberries have blue, they're blue because they have a lot of blue flavonoids, and raspberries have a lot of red flavonoids. You can even buy supplements that are like raspberry flavonoids and stuff. But it's like ridiculous. Just eat raspberries. Like everybody likes eating raspberries.
Right.
But the point is, like, a lot of people have genes where they're more dependent on those flavonoids to protect against inflammation, which is just another indicator that our ancestors for thousands of years, at least in that tribe and those people with those genes, they probably dried out a bunch of berries all the time. They probably ate them a lot or dug them out in the winter. Have you ever seen that TV show Alone?
No.
It's pretty entertaining, man. They drop people off.
Check it out.
Yeah, it's fun. They drop people off in the wilderness, and then they they give them tools, right? Like a knife and a bow and arrow and a tarp. And they have 10 people that start, and then they just see who can survive the longest, and whoever does gets like $1 million basically. And it's really funny because number one, everybody's intermittent fasting, right? Like nobody's like, yeah, I'm waking up and having breakfast and then I'll go fishing. They're all like, well, I'm going to go see if I can catch a fish so I can have lunch today.
Right.
And then number two, it's hilarious because sometimes they have these vegans on there. And they're just like, plants. I just love plants. And then, like 2 weeks later, they're like, literally like, so I'm starving to death out here and I'm looking for meat so I can survive. And they're like checking out, they're dying. And that's our ancestors, and some people are picking berries and stashing them in these little stashes and drying them out and like making berry leather and stuff. And like our ancestors did that kind of stuff. So it shouldn't be surprising, at least, that our genetics would be disposed to, having that stuff regularly.
Yeah. What about some kind of like alternative methods? Like I think of them as like, like sauning and cold plunging. Are these types of things helpful for some of the conversations that you talk about in terms of protecting against these artificial estrogens, heavy metals, things like that can be disruptive to just like hormone regulation?
Oh yeah, for sure. Sauna is interesting because number one, you sweat, right? And they've done studies. They call them BUS studies, blood, urine, and sweat, BUS. And they measure your urine. And then there's like hardly any phthalates and BPA and fake estrogens and whatnot. And they have those same people go into a sauna and then they measure their sweat. And it's full of estrogen. It's just chock full. So it's like, clearly it's a good way to get rid of some of that chemical out of your system, and make sure to take a shower right after so you wash it off, right? Otherwise you just reabsorb it and there's not much point to that. Because you get other benefits from the sauna, like you get heat shock proteins, right? So then the heat shock proteins help refold misfolded protein. So it's kind of like autophagy. Autophagy does a lot of recycling and trash taking and stuff, and heat shock proteins do as well. They're like big barrels. If you look at them under like, the crystal structure and stuff, and you like, literally electron microscopy and things, they look like big giant barrels, like trash barrels. That's a heat shock protein. So anyway, like you can look up HSP 70, for example, like heat shock protein 70. That's the most classic one that everybody talks about. So there's a lot of benefits to that. The cold plunge, not so much for the estrogens. It's good for you, but it's not as much related to the estrogens unless you have depression or something from the estrogen chemicals, I suppose, or something like that.
Yeah.
And the other thing is everybody's always asking me, well, what about just sweating from working out? It's perfectly great. Like get out and exercise and sweat with that. You put an extra layer on so that you do sweat. The minimum effective dose seems to be at least 10 minutes of sweating 3 times a week. It doesn't matter if it's a sauna or exercise, although the sauna is better because you're making heat shock proteins. You're not going to get the heat shock proteins just from exercise. Interesting.
And one thing you mentioned before was sleep, which I feel like everyone overlooks sleep hygiene. Is like just this fundamental aspect of how our bodies function. And we've lost basically an hour of sleep on average over the last 100 years. So for us to be talking about, fixing some of these hormonal problems and not talking about sleep hygiene, it seems like an oversight. So how do you think about sleep hygiene and its role in this whole conversation?
Yeah, massively important, without a doubt. Some of these bodybuilders I work with, like one of my clients got second place in Mr. Olympia, and he was sleeping 14 hours a night.
Are you serious?
Oh yeah, like 8 p.m. going to bed at 8 p.m. and waking up at like 10 a.m. Like literally every day. Wow. It's massive for like healing and recovery, and the hormones are a huge component of that. So obviously, if your hormones are super low, again, usually your sleep is going to be disrupted. Like women will tell you this, right? Like postmenopausal women, the hallmark of being postmenopause is like, I wake up at 3 a.m. and I can't get back to sleep. That's what they always say if their progesterone is super low. It's progesterone. But testosterone is important too. They oftentimes don't realize that, but